Hello, welcome to Know the Faith, Defend the Faith. My name is William Hemsworth, and thank you so much for joining me for this week's program. I'm very excited to have my guest on, Efren Menny. He has a popular blog called Menny Thoughts. Great follow on Twitter, and an awesome podcast called Priestly Passion. Efren, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. How you doing this morning? It's morning where you are.
It's morning where I'm at. It's 9:05.
Yeah.
No, so thank you. So our topic today, well, first and foremost, happy anniversary to you and your lovely wife.
Thank you so much. Five years a day. Couldn't be happy.
That's awesome. That's amazing. Marriage is such a great blessing, and again, congratulations. Now, our topic today, we had talked about this early last month before I guess stuff got all crazy in the world. But we're going to talk about the contribution of African Americans to Catholicism in the United States.
Right.
And the reason I wanted to talk to you about this is because of your post on Twitter during February. A lot of stuff I had no idea about. So again, I just want to thank you for coming on. It's a privilege to have you on.
Yeah, those posts were really eye-opening for a lot of people. So that was good to know. Or good to do.
No, they were definitely eye-opening. And it's funny because I consider myself a student of church history, but I hadn't heard about a lot of those things. So I had to go back and start researching, which was a great thing. As like I said, it was eye-opening for me as well. But you've been featured on Big Pulpit a couple times, and which is a great honor. You're doing great work. But one of your articles was about Saint Peter Claver. If I'm not mistaken, he's your patron saint.
Right. And so how I went about finding Peter Claver was, I guess during the RCIA, it's always encouraged or it's mandatory that you you have to find a confirmation saint that you can find somebody to imitate Christ to, or Christ, somebody you can ask for intercessions for, all that good stuff in the faith. And I think in December or so, I bought a book at the half price bookstore, like 365 Days of Saints or something like that. And so for some time, I was just skimming through the book, not going in any chronological order, but just going through. And, I didn't really find anybody, despite, their remarkable records and, achievements. St. Augustine, the Irenaeuses, the Francis de Sales, all those wonderful figures. But I didn't think they spoke to me, because I guess your confirmation saint is somebody who's supposed to speak to you and everything that you feel. And so I was just flipping through one day, and then I came to September 9th, and I read the entry on St. Peter Claver, and I was just immediately blown away by, although this very short, 200, entry on him. I ended up reading his biography by John Slattery and was just really amazed. And if I may talk a little bit about him right now.
Please.
Yeah, so St. Peter Claver was a Jesuit Spanish priest. He, just like many saints, he was born in nobility, a wealthy, prominent family. But somehow during the line, he felt the call to the priesthood. And so he ended up going to seminary. And so while in seminary, he ended up meeting St. Alphonsus Rodriguez. And he was just like a lay porter, but he was extremely wise, and he ended up forming St. Peter Claver's, whole like worldview and his mission that he would go on to go in Cartagena, Colombia with. So St. Alphonsus and Peter Claver, would meet and talk all the time. And so upon him finishing seminary, St. Peter Claver goes to Cartagena, Colombia on the advice from St. Alphonsus. And St. Peter Claver gets there, and he's already following the work of a predecessor named Alfonso de Sandoval, who was already there in Colombia, doing similar work with slaves at one of the largest ports in the hemisphere. So Alfonso de Sandoval was and also another pivotal player who isn't really recognized in the New World with the slave trade. But anyway, St. Peter Claver sort of picks up the missionary baton from Alfonso de Sandoval, and St. Peter Claver hits the ground running with these slaves on the ship. So the slave trade from Congo to South America was a huge trek for these slaves to endure on the ship. Rancid conditions. Many slaves were thrown off the boat and fed to whatever wild aquatic life. And so the slave trade was the ship conditions were unbearable. And so St. Peter Claver would just go in like nothing and administer to the slaves once they hit Cartagena, Colombia. He would immediately tend to their physical needs, like give them food, water. And along the way, he encountered a lot of hostility between those Spanish owners. But St. Peter Claver continued to do his work, and even when the slaves got off the ship, he would have a huge apostolate and ministry, evangelizing and providing catechesis with the slaves. And it's said that he baptized some 300,000 slaves, but
Wow.
that's a conservative number. Some estimate even more than that. But he wasn't also, they call him the apostle of the slaves, but he also evangelized Protestants, Muslims, and anybody who entered and frequented the port of Cartagena, Colombia. And so when he was canonized in the 19th century, him and his formation or spiritual director, Saint Alphonsus Rodriguez, both were canonized together as like a powerful, strong bond that these two men shared. And plus, it was a defining moment for Saint Peter Claver in his canonization, because so much globally was happening with the slave trade, and many countries were abolishing the slave trade, but slavery was still a huge practice and institution still in that time. So to have Saint Peter Claver canonized at the time was a powerful message for human rights and the dignity of the human person globally.
So what is it that drew you to him initially?
Yeah, so something I really thought about St. Peter Claver, as I said before, as I was going through, the St. Francis de Sales and the St. Augustine's, these were, very remarkable figures in church history and doctors of the churches. But, I didn't feel a personal connection to them. But something that it got me when I read St. Peter Claver was like the personal connection of a slave. And I think that's I think the slave has like two meanings to it. Like apparently those slaves are from Africa, and I'm African Black American here in America, and I'm a descendant of those people that St. Peter Claver evangelized. So definitely that sort of spoke to me. And then in addition, just thinking about being a slave to Jesus, or just being a slave and then being free and then living for Christ. I think that was a powerful, like a little metaphor. Like, yeah, you were once a slave in your own passions and desires, but then Christ liberated you to, something way more fulfilling and righteous. And so that double-fold meaning of, identifying myself with, all the other Africans that's dispersed across the world, and South America and the Caribbean and Europe and Asia and in Native Africa, and the theological implications of being free from slavery to sin spoke to me very, very much.
Oh, that's awesome. Amen. Now in February you had, like I said, you had many posts in February. What are some of the contributions of African Americans to Catholicism in the United States?
Yeah,
It's kind of a broad question.
Yeah, so to just piggyback on people who are not familiar, back in February during Black History Month, I guess every day I did like a small daily trivia fact about something in Black history. And so I just did it. Or originally I didn't do it. I didn't know what I was doing at first, but it just evolved into something after the second day of February. I was like, oh, maybe I should keep running with this, because it seems like a lot of people are private messaging me about it and all this kind of stuff. So basically it was just 28 days of, I guess, Black Catholic trivia and like facts that really was popular for a lot of people. But one thing I think about, there's so many contributions about, Black Catholic history. But I think, for me, when I think about Black Catholic history, I think the biggest contribution that Black Catholics could offer, or African Americans could offer the church, is just freely being available to the church. And I think one example of that that's really, really powerful happened after the Civil War, of course. After the Civil War, I guess it was the Negro problem, as many people, commonly refer to it. And that was like, hey, what are we going to do with all these slaves now that, some conservative estimate 4 million are free? And so I think at that moment, the church had a good opportunity to, capitalize and, reap that spiritual harvest that they wanted for so long. And so it was a guy named Archbishop Martin Spaulding of Baltimore. And he wasn't a big fan of, he wasn't the biggest fan of the slaves and the slaves at all. But he saw it necessary that, these newly freed people have some right to religious education and spiritual education. And so Archbishop Spaulding, said, hey, all other brother bishops in America, we need to get together and create a council where we can address the, spiritual and religious needs of these newly freed Black people in America. And, he's submitted to Rome his petition. The propaganda, or the Congregation of Propaganda, gave him the AOK green light. And they even named him Archbishop Spaulding the apostle or apostolic delegate to the to this council that they were going to create. And so some of the things that the people or the bishops were going to discuss during this time were like Black vocations, having men and women enter the seminary. They were going to create, seminaries for African Americans, having a national, I guess, like overseer over this nationwide platform to, evangelize and provide spiritual and religious needs of African American. Ultimately, they were going to appoint Spaulding to this post. But, a lot of bishops ended up seeing that as, horrible, and they didn't like that approach. So, the second plenary council begins, and all the bishops in America at the time address everything but the issue at the main table. So they address every other theological, spiritual question, but the question of what to do with the religious needs of African Americans. So Archbishop Spaulding, he comes along again and says, hey, we need to have another extraordinary council to really get down to this issue. And so piggybacking again, they wanted to have this national overseer bishop who would, patrol and make sure every bishop was following the recommendations from Rome about how to address the spiritual and needs of African Americans. But the bishops didn't like that because, they didn't want you don't want your power to be supplanted, and you want to do everything on your own, and you don't want to have nobody telling you what to do. And so many bishops just completely objected to, this new idea that was presented by Archbishop Martin Spaulding in Rome about how to, effectively address the spiritual needs of the African Americans. And so what ultimately happens after the council is that, the bishops agree that, hey, we need to just do what's best for our own diocese. And, some of the bishops ultimately, do little small piecemeal things, but nothing really to combat the solution of Black vocations, religious needs, and seminaries. But then again, majority of bishops just go off to do the same reticence and abstention practices that they've done before. And so I bring that up as just like it's a contribution in a sense that, African Americans were freely available, and, right. We could have contributed ourselves to the church, and, we were available. But, the failure of the bishops at the time, but you had some bishops, not all the bishops, but you had a few bishops who were super enthused about this new plan from Rome. But, the bishops just didn't want to get along with it. And so ultimately what happened is the bishops go to their diocese, and some do little small things. But the bishops ultimately ask for European missionaries to come, since they don't want to, lift the weight themselves. So they petition to have, European missionaries to come to America. And, ultimately that wish would get fulfilled in 1871, I think, with the Mars Hill Fathers, who were, British missionaries dedicated to, the missions in Africa. But, they saw a bountiful harvest in America with the new slaves. So the Mars Hill Fathers came, and, Archbishop Spaulding was super happy because, finally somebody's here to, evangelize and, address the needs of these African Americans. So, I think that's a very, profound moment. I mean, when I look back on Black Catholic history in America. Like, man, it wasn't the best plan, but it was a plan.
It was a start.
Yeah.
So, what did Archbishop Spaulding ultimately do in his region?
Archbishop Spaulding, he never ceased that, trying to get the missions and the evangelistic needs of African Americans. He just kept going, and he did some things that he did the best that he could do, but ultimately, he wanted a national platform for African Americans. But Archbishop Spaulding did ultimately got his wish granted, but he died in 1872, I think, after the Martin brothers came to America from Britain. So yeah, he came. I mean, they came and they fulfilled his wish by having a group of men come who were extremely zealous and had extreme fervor for the missions for African Americans. But he didn't live to see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
When the missionaries came, did they go to one location or did they disperse throughout the country?
Yeah, so I think the Marshall Father, really typically focused in the Northeast area. That was like in the Baltimore area.
Okay.
And so, and another thing good about Black Catholic history too is that when we look back at Black Catholic history, Black Catholics have typically been like central in like the Gulf Coast area, like New Orleans.
Right.
In not ancient times, but colonial times, St. Augustine, Florida had a very thriving, population of Black Catholics at that time in St. Augustine, Florida, and it's one of the pivotal city for Black Catholic history. And then Maryland, was also a pivotal area for Black Catholic history. So along the Northeast and the Gulf Coast area of the Southeast United States, there were like strong pockets of Black Catholics existing way before 1800s.
Okay. Now, one of the people you had talked about is Venerable Henriette DeLille. Did I say that name right?
Yeah. Henriette DeLille of New Orleans. She's a pivotal player in Black Catholic history, and I think the thing that makes Henriette DeLille comes alive is because she has like a twofold story that I think that's powerful. So Henriette DeLille, is mixed race Creole woman. Her father is French or Spanish, and then her mother is mixed race Creole Black woman. And so she grows up and she's pretty fair skinned, and she has she grows up in New Orleans and has the pomp and elegance of the wealthy class because of the system that they grew up in called placage. And so placage was basically a horrible system. I mean, it's really a horrible system now we think about it. Was a system in place by the French and Spanish where they could come to mate and have mistresses basically with slaves and Native Americans without necessarily having the sacramental aspect of it. So they could have mistresses and common law marriage, basically these slaves and new women without necessarily marrying them. And so Henriette DeLille grows up in that system of placage in New Orleans. She grows up, has all the pomp, elegance. She knows French. She grows and goes to Gap parties and like all the elegant stuff. Her mom is like super wealthy. And one thing that happens in her life is that she knows that slaves don't have it the best. And so she goes to minister and act out. I mean, because it's forbidden for slaves to read and write at this time, she goes to act out certain scenes of the Bible and salvation history to the slaves, to give them religious education. Right. But something happens to Henriette DeLille. She has a profound religious experience. And especially when her mom dies, she gives away, in true saint fashion, she gives away all her inheritance. And so Henriette DeLille also, because she's so fair-skinned, she can pass as white, but she decides to align and identify herself with African Americans during this time. And so, that comes with a whole bunch of baggage in itself because, you're subjugated to, attacks and harsh treatment and, not the best treatment in the 19th century America for African Americans. And so Henriette DeLille does these two things. And along with her friends, she ended up creating the Sisters of the Holy Family, which is the second religious congregation for Black women in America next to the Oblate Sisters of Providence that happened, 20 some years before. But the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans end up doing, phenomenal social work, meeting the needs of Black men and women who are, in desperate need of, goods, services, relief, education. And so Henriette DeLille and, her and her other accomplices that, formed the Sisters of the Holy Family ended up accomplishing a lot of, good in the New Orleans area in just a short amount of time with what they had available. And so I think when I think back on Henriette DeLille, especially the fact that she willingly gave up her inheritance and, chose to identify and align herself with African Americans, and the fact that she, broke down the gender barrier and the sex barrier of marriage during that time, because she was expected to, grow up in the placate system. Her mother was grooming her as a prime candidate because she wanted her to, have a life of, good and not struggle. And her mom was grooming her for that placate system, but she willingly didn't want that and chose to dedicate herself to, poverty and, giving a selfless life to the needs of others who definitely had it way worse in New Orleans at the time.
Now, how about in the 20th century? Is there any key figures in the 20th century that helped with the contribution?
Yeah, so some in the 20th century, somebody I think is super important is Thomas Turner Wyatt. I think Thomas Turner Wyatt, I think how I like to characterize, Black Catholic history is in three parts. So you have basically the pre-colonial part, which is like, hey, you have these small pockets of growing Black areas in America and the Gulf Coast and the Northeast. That's from, the beginning of the arrivals of the settlers to, 1800s or so. Right. Then from the 1800s to about, I like to say somewhere in the early 19th or the 20th century, you have this period of striving for, making your voice heard and, striving for legitimacy in the church. And so you see figures like Henriette DeLille, Augustus Tolton, Daniel Rudd, these type of people come around who want to make, Black people's voice in the church be known and heard and legitimized. And then once you get past, the legitimizing period, you get into the modern day kind of area from early 20th century to, kind of present to now. And so in this period, I think, Blacks just really wanted equality in institutions. And I think what Thomas Turner Wyatt did was really piggyback on the success of Daniel Rudd in the late 19th century in his Colored Congress of basically creating a caucus of the laity of African Americans. And Thomas Turner ended up doing the same thing, but he creates this new organization where, Black people, especially Black Catholics, or it's mainly for Black Catholics, can, have equality in the seminaries, in the vocations, in the religious schools. So his whole principle is seeing institutional and systematic, racism and discrimination in these white Catholic institutions being dismantled so that African Americans can, achieve full equality in what it means to be a brother and sister of Christ in the Catholic Church. And so I think his movement of the, I want to say it was called the Federated Colored Catholics, was really pivotal in driving equality in institutions. And I think one would be remiss not to include him in a summary of a key pivotal player in the 20th century.
Sure. Now, how about today? What can we do as a church, as a whole, to further everything that these great people in the past started?
Yeah, I think one key thing I think is super beneficial, because when we look at Black Catholic history, is often neglected, and it is neglected. And when we look at Black Catholic history, we have figures like Blessed Solanus Casey and Elizabeth Ann Seton. These figures, overshadow, and these are great figures, by the way, in American history, and the remarkable heroic virtues that they did. These figures have done an extreme amount of good that their stories are popularized and glamorized and, the mainstream Catholic um, narrative. But, in Black Catholic history, we have just as many, great figures like Henriette DeLille and Augustus Tolton. And, I don't think their stories get as much equality and like notoriety just because, Black Catholics don't own, or we don't have that power to own and control the narrative of the mainstream, Catholic world. But what we can do is influence it. And so one thing I think we can definitely do is push for, definitely push for, having African American history incorporated into American Catholic history, especially in, those homeschooling curriculums and definitely those Catholic schools across the country. I think that's a big thing to see. I have one textbook here, just out of curiosity, that I bought from, a bookstore, a used bookstore, and it doesn't have anything on Black Catholic history in it. And, that's kind of appalling too, because it's like, man, African Americans have really been from the beginning, from the first settler here, have been, going extremely hard for the Catholic Church and all its contributions, and have tried to make inroads and, finding equality in the only place that we've ever found home, which is the Catholic Church. And to go back to the quote I said the other day, Daniel Rudd said he saw the Catholic Church as the one that could, break the color line. And, that was late 19th century. And the church, had a perfect opportunity, especially after the Civil War, to seize on that. But, the church may never get that same opportunity as it had back then, but the church definitely can play a pivotal role. And definitely one way they can do that is by incorporating Black Catholic history into, the Catholic textbooks. In addition, things that a lot of people have said already today, like, advocating against, speaking out against, racism and, addressing that as a super crucial area, and advocating for just policies that have humane treatment and, death penalty and criminal justice reform is something that the bishops and the clergy can definitely speak out of. And I know a lot of people don't necessarily think the church should be involved in politics, but I think that's just rubbish, because the Catholic Church has always been involved in politics. I think the Catholic Church has been the light in the darkness since the beginning on, reining in the secular world's craziness and madness and bringing back their voice of truth on, like, hey, you guys are not following the commandments and, you're not following natural law. Here's what the church says, and here's what, is natural to all men. So the Catholic Church definitely does have a huge role to play, especially now in America with all what's going on with the recent events in last month. The Catholic Church can definitely lead on it.
No, couldn't agree more. And like you said, when you started doing all the stuff in February, I had no idea about a lot of this stuff. So it was really eye-opening. And I think I'm not the only one. I'm sure there was a lot of other people where a lot of the stuff was eye-opening to them. Now, are there any resources or anything that the listeners can go to learn more about Black Catholic history? Are there any websites out there or anything?
Yeah, I think one website is really good is the National Black Catholic Congress. Those guys meet up annually every year to, discuss, the needs of different parishes and talk about the state of, Black Catholics as a whole in the country. And, that's a good tradition that Daniel Rudd started in the late 19th century. For 5 years. He had the laity come together for 5 years and then somehow just disbanded. But, the National Black Catholic Congress picked that back up in the late 20th century, and they've been going strong ever since. So that's a good website. And then a lot of people have just asked me, like, hey, what's good books that you should read? And, a lot of people will say different books, but I just think the primer on, Black Catholic history is by Brother Cyprian Davis, The History of Black Catholics in the United States. I think even though it's, came out in the 90s, it still covers, from first arrival to modern times. And it goes in depth and research and footnotes and endnotes, and it has so much wealth to really give you every minute detail in Black Catholic history about figures and places and cities, both white and Black people who did marvelous things for the advancement of Black Catholics in America to see equality in the fullness of the church.
Great. So how about you for a moment? Your blog and your podcast, how are those going?
It's going well. I think the podcast over Priestly Passion is sort of like on a standstill because COVID-19, and I had a whole bunch of interviews going, but we had to stop. But I am hoping to get back in the game with that. As far as me writing, I tend to write. I mean, now that I'm on summer vacation from being an educator, I tend to write more like once a week now. Some things I think I want to address more on the issue of the churches, just exploring more about Black Catholic history. I think I have something written about Black Catholic history that I finished, touching on that topic of, African Americans after the Civil War, and then just giving my own thoughts on it about how, it wasn't the perfect plan, but it was something to work with that they could have, developed on. So definitely continue to write more. I think it's just, just relaxing.
I agree. What's your blog website?
It's you're gonna put me on the spot. It's at WordPress at mennythoughts.com, I think.
Okay, yeah. mennythoughts.wordpress.com.
Yeah.
Great blog, a lot of great insights. And Efren, I thank you so much for coming on the program. Any closing thoughts you want to share with the listeners about what we talked about today?
Yeah, I mean, I barely touched on a fragment of, Black Catholic history.
Small portion.
They're a small speck on the grand scheme of, 400 plus years of wisdom. And I would just encourage you to just continue to, everybody wants to, I've received so many direct messages like, hey, what can I do? What can I do? And it's just the best thing to do is just, learn, and not just learn just for the sake of it's trendy or it's cool, but learn genuinely just to, have a deeper appreciation for your neighbor and to love your neighbor better. And listen, listening always helps. Don't be so quick to talk, but listen and hear what others have to say, regardless if they don't look like you or don't share the same opinion.
All right, amen. Well, again, thank you for coming on. And like you said, we just covered a small fraction of everything, but no doubt it's going to be beneficial for a lot of people. So I thank you very much. Take some time on your anniversary to come on.
Yeah, thank you so much. You have a good one.
No, you as well. God bless you.
Yeah, God bless you too.